All right, welcome to the VBT webinar on September 27, 2020. As I just seek really to share some tools with you guys that I've found to be really helpful during this quarantine time. Past few months, I've spent, probably over 100 hours learning and creating different sheets to help me process a lot of these VBT uses, namely 3 of them, which we'll go over today, which is predicting 1 rep maxes, using a linear regression, and also looking at the area under the curve metric that was created by Mladen, and then lastly, kind of my own personal touch on using velocity 1 rep maxes within a session to dose session load. And so that's something that's really interesting to me, and I hope it is to you guys. You'll have access to the sheets, and we'll actually play with it if we can together for like the last 10 minutes. We'll kind of all interact on the same spreadsheet once we go over this stuff. So I have a few slides first to go over. So let me get started with these, all right? So very first thing that VBT is pretty good at doing that I think a lot of people don't really know how to do on their own using VBT is basically predicting 1 rep max. And you can do it with 2 data points. Really simple. There's even a much better write-up on how to do this by Brian Mann and some other researchers from Spain and from some other places who wrote up a phenomenal article. I want to say it was like February or April this year on Strength Conditioning Journal. I've linked it at the end of this PowerPoint as well for you guys to download a copy of it. It does a really good job of explaining how simple yet how sometimes not so perfect it is to estimate a 1 rep max using VBT. So basically you use a load or a percentage, and then also the best average velocity of a set. So here's what that means. So let's take 2 data points. I do a set of 5 reps with 225, which could roughly be 50 to 70% of my max. And then I do another set with 365, which might be 90% of my max, or something that's like 85 to 90%. Maybe we're talking back squat right now. It could be a box squat, it could be anything, it could be deadlift. And with those 2 data points, I did 5 reps in the first one, and maybe I just did 3 reps in the second one, because obviously it's a really high percentage. It's important to denote, first of all, that we are using average velocities rather than peak for predicting 1 rep max is a little bit more consistent. But then also we're just choosing the best one of that set. So with my set of 225 for 5, I'm choosing the best velocity rep that I got and taking that out and comparing it also with the best velocity rep that I got with the 365 for 3. And then from there, I'm going to run a super basic linear regression trend line between those 2 points. And then I have what's called an MVT at the end. So the MVT is a minimum velocity threshold, and you guys can choose this yourself, because it's not, this is what you read up in Mann's, Dr. Mann's article is, and also from Mladen work, you'll notice that no one has completely decided on what the MVT should be. And rightly so, there's a lot of things to take in consideration. So the minimum velocity threshold is essentially the most amount of weight, or I'm sorry, the slowest you can move your max, the slowest you can move the heaviest weight. So if JT decided to max bench and Jeremy decided to max bench, whatever speed that JT ended up finishing with on his last rep, whether it's a 3RM, 5RM, 1RM, that's his MVT for that lift, and that's JT. And then Jeremy, same for you. Your slowest that you moved, that one. Does it kind of make sense so far? So the MVT is like the floor. It's like I can't move anything slower than this at that weight. And that has to be set. You have to have the MVT in place in order for the linear regression to work, because it goes from this data point to this data point all the way to the floor. And it tells you what you could lift as a trend at that lowest speed, which again, for max bench for JT might be like a 0.18. For Jeremy might be a 0.21. There's a huge difference in that, actually. If you were to change it from a 0.18 to a 0.21, you would get a pretty significant difference. So we'll get into more of that later as to why that's important, but they're essentially um, three things that you need to be thinking about, to determine your MVT. One is the lift itself. The MVT of a squat is going to be very different than a bench, because a squat, you just can't move it as slowly as a bench on your last heavy rep. So it might be like a 3.0 or a 3.5. Some people say 2.5. Deadlift is pretty slow. And then if you think about Olympic weightlifting, like a clean, and this is what Brian Mann had noticed back when he was at Missouri, it's like the slowest that he's seeing cleans that are like good cleans, it might be like a 1.35 average velocity, right? And DJ, you would notice this too as Olympic weightlifting coach. Like, you don't want a slow clean. Like at some point you have to draw the line. Like, what is the minimum speed I'm willing to move this clean, and predicting it off of that. So that's important. So we'll call that.
I got a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Or just not really a question, but just I have to talk through it to understand it. So basically, the minimum velocity, if I take all 5 of those reps, the rep that's the slowest is my minimum velocity. And then I'm taking the best rep and comparing it to my, let's say, 90% in order to get my average. Correct?
No, that's actually not correct, JT.
Okay.
I may have confused you. So in that set of 5 of 225, right? Just that lighter set, you're only taking 1 rep away from that. The other ones you can throw away for now.
Okay.
So you're taking just what was the best velocity of that one, and what was the best velocity of the heavy one. Because if you don't, let's say you just took like, and you'll see this as we go through the Google Sheets. If you just pick any old rep, and let's say it's slow, and then you do a heavier weight and it's the same speed, then what's your linear regression? Your max is going to be like 1,000 pounds, because the trend is going just straight this way. So you want, obviously, for it to be like as fast as you can move 225, right? And then as fast as you can move 365. And then that will set a proper trend line of what your max probably would be at a 0.12. That kind of makes sense now?
Okay, I get that portion, but when you were talking about the minimum velocity threshold, the slowest you can move your max load,
yeah,
I wouldn't acquire that through those 2 lifts.
No, that's something you just already need to decide on ahead of time. Yep. That's why I put a number 1 here. It says must be established ahead of time based on, lift, coach prep. Yeah. So you'll see that in the sheet. You can type that in. You can adjust it several times. This is what's key, man. This is what a lot of the VBT technologies are missing. All the apps out there, and I've been talking to the owner of VitTruve and just recommending, like, hey, man, you need to have a place for the user to alter the MVT if they want. And of course, it takes some education. You got to be able to know what MVT you're going to go with, but you have to have that in order for it to tell you what you want. And then simply put, here's the formula. I just chose cells A1, A2, B1, B2 as a default, but that's the formula, right? It's whatever MVT you want, right? So it's equals MVT. So let's say you put 0.18. That's what you want on your bench, times the slope, times the array there, plus the intercept. That's the formula. That's going to give you an estimated 1 rep max. So just covering that now, it'll make so much more sense later when we are actually playing with some of this stuff. All right, now that we have the ability to predict / estimate 1 rep max, we can start looking at another cool thing, which is called the area under the curve. So this is something that's not very popular from what I've seen. I haven't really seen many people talk about this, and I'm a big follower of Mladen Jovanovich's work, so I notice when stuff that he does pops up. I think this was an older thing that he put out. But man, this is so stinking cool to me. So like, you take this linear regression, and that's this curve right here. So like, this is a whole workout. If you look at starting in the bottom right and going in reverse, this was the first set that was done, moved it faster than a 1 whatever, and then a 1.0, and then a 0.8, 0.6. And so the slowest it ended up taking it was a predicted 0.06 at 250 pounds. So, the numbers aren't perfect here. It's fine. What I wanted as a visual for you guys to have is this space here. Everything that's under here is what's called the area under the curve. And this can be calculated. It's like square footage. And so the score of this particular evaluation is 224. This will make more sense later. But if you talk about speed, strength, speed, okay, I'm an athlete that I'm really strong, but I can't move it fast, or I'm an athlete that can move lightweight really fast, but I'm not very strong. All this actually can be kind of uh, measured in this one metric, and it's not perfect, doesn't tell you the whole story, but area under the curve is basically like the combination of the two. How fast I can move lighter weight and how much weight I can actually lift gives you a metric. And it's also done pretty easily in sheets. And so, again, I don't think you'll value this as much right now as I'm explaining it until you see it compared to some other case studies that I'll show you later. But just wanted to at least have this slide as a reference for you guys to actually have the formula. If you wanted to play with it, it'll make more sense later. So we'll keep it moving. All right, and then the third thing we're going to talk about is called VINOL. And I know already you're probably like overwhelmed with some of these acronyms and stuff, but this was so important, man. Like essentially what every strength conditioning coach tries to do is determine the dose of the prescription that they give. Like, is this too much? Is this not enough? In season, off season. And so INOL is a method created by Hristov, kind of basing off the Philippine table, which is a simple way of calculating uh, the the load or dose, if you will, stimulus of a particular session. So I know you guys have seen tonnage. I know you guys have seen reps in reserve, RPE. You know, there's a lot of ways that you can look at how do you quantify dose, or and some of those are pretty subjective. This one is pretty objective. And so in order for me to even really, in order for you to understand VINOL, you have to first understand INOL, which I hope to explain right now with these guidelines down below. It's the math is simple. All you're doing is taking um, the number of lifts, NL, because it's just reps, okay, without anybody getting too confused here. NL is reps, and then you divide it by 100 minus 100 times the percent of the weight that you're doing. So if it's 80% of my max and I'm doing 5 reps, it's going to give me a score. And that's my INOL. It's as simple as that. So here's another example. 8 reps at 73% of my max equals 0.3. So my INOL is 0.3. And if I add that up an entire session, I get an INOL score, which at the bottom you'll notice for like a total INOL score, these are the guidelines. If it's anything over 2, it's like I'm dying. Like I'm going to be sore for 11 days. I won't be able to walk. If it's, or it's pretty much overtraining. If it's like less than 0.4, it's really not enough. And so this is just a pretty uh, quick way to evaluate dose. And so if you look at this now, hopefully this is more helpful. On the far right, you'll see the INOL metrics as explained in the guideline. And then in sync with it, and these other two bars here are some other terminology that you'll recognize. One is, you know, overtraining, overreaching, and then just kind of that sweet spot, that kind of minimum effective volume, dose, you know, that place where most of us strength coaches probably want to put our athletes, but occasionally get to the blue and probably avoiding the red. We also kind of want to avoid the yellow if we can help it, you know, if we're in season or whatever. So you guys all tracking with this? This all kind of makes sense with,
Yeah.
okay, you know, the actual dose, the actual load. And the key thing, guys, and I learned this from Brian Tatum in Auburn football. The guy's a genius when it comes to volume and dosing. He taught me all of this stuff. Volume is key. Like, but the thing about this, it also takes into account load. So it's load and volume, and it's that's essentially all you need from a dosing standpoint. Of course, there's so many other variables, but I think at the most basic level of strength coaches, when we're programming, we just want to know the dose based upon load and volume. All right. And so what I've essentially done is just added the velocity component to it. And so the Google Sheets will show how I've done that. And at the end of the day, there's the INOL of what you think the dose is based on a max. And then there's the VINOL of what, in my opinion, is the actual dose. It's like, for example, you get your kids coming to a session, you have no idea how tired they are, you have no idea what their nervous system is like in that moment. And so there's the INOL of like, hey, assuming that you're in a pretty good state to train, this is what the load should be on your body. This is what the dose should be. If you're taking this much medicine, this much prescription, but here's what's actually happening with the dose because of the state that you were in. Velocity can help you figure that out. So hopefully that makes sense. We'll move on. Here's another just kind of example, between, this is like a basic microcycle, right? Week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. In my opinion, this is like kind of where you want to live. This is in the MEV, and then as you go, you adapt. And then that week 3, there's this, theory that after 2 weeks of training, then it kind of opens up your ceiling to hit far more volume, knowing that you might need to deload in week 4. So I threw this in there as well, just to kind of give us an overall idea of what we're looking at with dose, and just to keep us in the same train of thought, especially as we address these terminologies again: maximal recoverable volume, maximal adaptable volume, minimal effective volume, and maintenance volume. All right, and this is kind of how it looks in the sheet. And I do need to explain this. So this is an actual session from a powerlifter. His estimated 1 rep max that he gave me in the moment, he said this is like a training 1 rep max, is 680 on a back squat. And here we go. We go through the session, and through the Google Sheets tool that I've made, you type in the rep. So everything in gray is what you guys type in. And we set his minimum velocity threshold to 0.33. You see the MVT on the left there? That's something that you want to play around with when you have the sheet. So you can make it a 0.31, 0.28, it kind of depends on the device that you use. I should have thrown that in there too. Some devices are just slightly slower or slightly faster, like the Tendo versus the push band, for example. You might have a discrepancy there. So whichever device you use, choosing an MVT based on that. And we just decided to go with a 0.33 for Ryan, especially with that much weight. You just can't move that much weight much slower than that. So 0.33 is I think pretty fair. And his 1 rep max was taken without any velocity at all. So this is, again, we're just kind of typing the MVT in and just rolling with it. So on this particular day, he was working up to, I guess 635. I think that was a number that he already decided upon. He was going to get 4 reps, and then he was going to do a drop set. So here's the story as it unfolds here. You've got, 135 for 4. He moved it at a 1.2, but the set average velocity is a 1.08. So this is where, JT, I don't want you to get confused either, but I want you to know the difference is that there is a difference between best average velocity and set average velocity. Set average velocity is that for all 4 of those reps, he averaged a 108. But the best rep of those 4 was a 1.2. That makes sense? So the 1.2 is what we're using to calculate his velocity, his estimated 1 rep max over here on the left, the 692 so far, okay? And then as he goes, we're doing another set, 225, then 315, then 405, then 495. And all the while we're taking both best velocity of that set and then the average of that set. The set average is being used to calculate dose. We want to know the effect on his body. And so the way we're doing that is assuming that, okay, if he's moving at a 6.7, he can move this much weight at a 6.7. We're going to figure out the relative intensity of that 6.7. And then we're going to base an INOL score off of that relative intensity. And then over here on the left, we're going to have both. We're going to have the INOL and the VINOL. INOL has no knowledge of the quality of each rep, the velocity of the rep, but the VINOL does. And this is pretty spot on. It's also giving a velocity-based RPE, which is kind of cool. And so he ends up going through this whole session and doing a really good job. He hits all his reps. He hits 635 for 4, which us normal human beings couldn't do that very well. And the average that he moved, 635 for 4, is a 3.8. So that's pretty insane. But he did end up hitting a 4.1. So what's happening is I just want you guys to notice that as the session goes, you'll get to play with this. The best average velocity is calculating his estimated max for the day, for the moment. And he told me that his true 1 rep max is probably like 705. So there you go. So like he was being conservative choosing the 680, but his actual one rep max, assuming that all is perfect in the world, is 705. And so that's why you have the higher velocity one rep max there. But if you felt like crap that day and didn't have the smelling salts with them, then maybe, maybe it's a lot lower than that. Maybe he's moving these heavier weights slower. And then over here on set average velocity, it's calculating dose at the same time, what we're calling VINOL. So that may not be of any interest to you guys, VINOL. I think it's pretty freaking cool, especially when you do it enough times with yourself. And I think everybody in the chat right now has a VBT device at home. So I would just encourage you guys to use this tool, do it in your garage. All you have to do is type in what you know your max to be, decide on the MVT, and just start chipping away at the reps you got, the load you picked, and then the average and best velocities. And it's going to tell you a real-time dose on that. And it's color-coded to show you if that's a MEV or a MAV or MRV based on that. And it's pretty stinking cool. Here's just another look at it. Here are the actual formulas of INOL and VINOL that you guys can reference later. Again, it's calculated.
How are you getting that RPE?
So the RPE is not something we'll talk about in the scope of this talk necessarily, but it's calculated exactly how you would a normal RPE on the relative intensity scale. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure you've seen those relative intensity charts, that this would be considered very hard if it's an 80% for 7.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Right? It's based on that.
Okay.
It's just basically saying it's attributing a score to what would be very hard. If it's 80% for 8, it'll automatically just total up across the entire session a total RPE of all the sets. Okay. If that's something that interests you too, you can see that formula. So here's me doing some front squats. First session, second session, I did 6 sets of 8. One day with 205 on my work sets. Then the other week, I think a week later, 225 with my work sets. And the INOL was supposed to be really high. It's in the blue. But what actually happened, because I moved it so well, even though it sucked, I was dying the whole time, for 4 sets of 8 with 205 and 225, I was still hitting some pretty dang good speeds. And so it's telling me that my dose was actually less than predicted. The VINOL is just another way of taking what's actually happening rep by rep, averaging it, and then determining, okay, that dose really wasn't that bad because I moved it so well. Does that make sense to you guys? All right, this is an important slide because VBT isn't perfect and we need to talk about its imperfections. So the first thing, so important with this one. For one rep max prediction, here's what we're assuming. We're assuming that every rep that we're doing is being performed as fast as possible. That's not always true, right? Like, we're definitely, when we're coaching kids up, we're telling them, if they have a squat set or a front squat set, we're probably more concerned about position and mechanics. And we're not telling the kid to drive to the ground as fast as possible on their warm-up set of 95, but we might, that might be a good cue of like, hey, let's start preparing for the heavier weight, start potentiating your muscles, move the lightweight fast. If you're predicting a 1 rep max, you need to move it as fast as possible in order for the data to be accurate, especially those lighter sets. Here's the other issue, is that potentiation is real. And every person in this webinar right now can attest to, okay, I've got 135 on my back on back squat. I've got no knee wraps. I've got no belts or anything. I'm just kind of moving. I'm just feeling it out. My body's not awake yet. I'm warming up with this weight. And if I'm going to predict a max based on this weight, then it assumes that I've already been warmed up. I'm kind of walking into this 135 as if I just did 315. Does that make sense? Because as I go on and I go 225 and 315, now the me that's moving the 315 was not the me that was moving the 135. And so the trend line isn't going to be as accurate. If I went back to the 135 after doing 315, it'll tilt it back up a little bit. And so Brian Mann and the other authors make note of this in the article, and they say that 1 rep max prediction for total and lower body lifts is not as accurate because there's so much potentiation that happens as you get to the heavier weights. But for bench press, it's pretty spot on. Still have the same issue, but I think if you guys can wrap your head around, if I'm taking this data point and this data point, but they're close together and I'm trying to draw a line, like it's going to give me a pretty radical number versus if it's probably more honest and like, okay, I did move this weight faster now that I'm potentiated, it'll be better. So all I'm saying on that, quick word of advice, because I did this with our summer football guys, don't take the first data point from the first set. Let them warm up with the first set, let them get potentiated, and then the second set, still kind of a light set, like 50 to 60%. Use that one if you want to predict the max. All right, and the last 2 points, VINOL dosing is based on velocity 1 rep max of the session, which is not always your goal. So in using VINOL, again, in my mind, it's a brilliant metric, and I think it's really cool, and I'm using it. But if it's going session by session, then it also assumes that within that session that I'm just doing some volume, that I'm trying to move it as fast as possible too. And I may not be. I don't like that may not be my goal. I'm actually trying to save my muscles for a heavy, for a tough set of 8. I'm not trying to move any of those 8 reps on front squat as fast as I can because I'm just trying to get to 8. It makes sense? Like the volume is the objective there. I'm trying to survive and move it to 8. If I move number 2 and 3 as fast as possible, it might take away from 7 and 8. And so there's that concept too of like, okay, I just need to make sure that I'm kind of, discerning one or the other. And what you can do to fix that and address that rather is a velocity 1 rep max profile that you figured out ahead of time. So when you're using VINOL, it's based off of a true profile that you've already done and not like within the session of how you feel, but kind of defeats the purpose because you want to know what your rep max is in the moment in the session. So just things to think about. Again, it's why VBT isn't perfect because it always assumes that it's as fast as you can in a predictive sense. And it's just not always true. Okay, last point. Users should always be cautious of the kinematics of the lift too, not changing in order to increase the velocity. Guys, I see it all the time. As soon as you give that kid the feedback, then they'll start doing everything they can to move it as fast as possible. In the weightlifting world, that's not always important either. I always think it's funny that Olympic weightlifting is called Olympic weightlifting instead of Olympic weight catching because it's more about you receiving the bar and the execution and timing. And if you're too caught up on that when you're trying to focus on the catch, then it could mess things up. But I'm talking about even back squat. One of our strongest linemen, if I put VBT on him, he almost like jumps off the ground. Like he like goes up through his toes and it's dangerous. The bar is like leaving his shoulders. It could be 315. He's still moving it that fast. And so, just got to be cautious with that, making sure the kinematics aren't changing because that also affects the consistency of it. You want them to have the same kinematics over time as they always do. And it might just be best that they don't even see the velocity in the moment. You just wait for them to see it after, depending on your goal. All right. And as far as what device you use, we're not going to get into this either. I try to put quite a few of the ones that I'm familiar with, Perch, GymAware, the push band. So at GAC, we have the Tendo unit, the push band, and the Vitruve. And I really like the Vitruve. It's actually out of Spain, and I'm beginning to love it more and more. The guys who own it and created the device several years ago did it because the Tendo was too expensive. And so they wanted to come up with a cheaper one. I know Rep 1 is out there. It's made here in the States, and it's kind of hard to get your hands on one of those. I think that's what you have, JT, right? So JT's got the Rep 1. So I don't know how different it is from the Vitruve, but the Vitruve's really
I just got it, so I haven't even had time to play with it. It literally has taken over a year to get it.
Yeah. But the Vitruve, you can get one, as far as I know, right away, and they're $300 or $400. They're from another country, but it all can be imperial instead of metric, and it's just really a neat app, and it predicts your 1 rep max as you go too. There's some things that I've recommended to them that they adjust, and they're taking that into consideration. So especially with the dosing part, they find that to be very intriguing. So we'll see if they end up.
Got a Rich.
What's up?
Vitruve, are they pretty close to being able to work with Team Builder? Is that what I heard?
Yeah, that's the goal. So, I don't know how public knowledge it is necessarily, but I guess it's, it wouldn't not be. I mean, the two companies are trying to work together to have software integration. So the data from Team Builder can be pushed to VitTruve and vice versa.
And right now, the only thing compatible with Team Builder is Bar Sensei, and I think there's one more.
GymAware.
GymAware, yeah. Those are super.
That's certainly helpful, because the last thing you need to worry about is, managing multiple software platforms. So, and VitTruve is not trying to be like its own full cloud service that I'm aware of. I think their goal is really just to provide the data, and analyze it at a pretty basic level. And then through Team Builder, what they're working on is some advanced features with VBT here in the next few weeks. So that's.
I think Rep One is trying to have their own cloud storage, because they have a app, or not an app, but a software separate from the device, where it'll track all that and athlete player profiles. But to try to get everybody off Team Builder, because most of your programs are on Team Builder now.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's far fetched, but
yeah,
neither here nor there.
All right, so in my opinion, this is the best VBT article I've come across, as far as it being just so comprehensive and helpful. I mean, the title is From Theory to Application. So it's trying to help all of us bridge the gap from, okay, up until this point, it's 2020, it's a recent article. What do we really know about VBT, and how can it be applied pragmatically? And this article achieves that. So I highly recommend you guys read it. I've read it several times. I've referred to it a lot. I have a link to the article here in the slide deck that you guys can take a look at later. So definitely recommend that. All right, it's time to mess around with some stuff. So if you guys have the link already to the sheets deal, then you can kind of follow along as I go through and sample some things. But I'll go ahead and do it as well, just, as you guys follow along. So however you want to do it, you can just kind of watch the screen or have it pulled up next to your Zoom. That way you can kind of follow along. Okay, the first one that I want to do on here is basically cover both a velocity profile that you guys can do, as well as figuring out area under the curve. So this area under the curve thing, again, I think is just one of the coolest things. And we'll get to that in a second. This is super easy to use. Rich, just type in your name, Rich Burnett, what exercise you're doing, what load, and you guys can save a copy of this whole sheet, to your desktop or your own Google Sheets files, and make several copies for yourself, for your athletes. On this particular tab right here, it's percent input. So just take note of that. I'm actually going to type percentage of the load instead of the load itself. All right, so let's say I'm trying to figure out my 1 rep max. I'm trying to predict it. So I'll do 20%, 40%, 60, 72, 88, and if I'm feeling good, 97, whatever. And it's already going to tell me the loads. So these velocities were from a different set here. I was just showing you how it works in terms of typing the percentage and it being based on your known 1 rep max. So this is either, you decide, this is either your legit, as Dan John would say, your max. It could be your training max. It's something. It's some reference point that you have for that lift of what you think is your max and how slow you moved it, or how slow you could move it if it came down to it, you were feeling good. So if it's a training max and you want to be more conservative, then maybe it is like 265 at a 0.17, and that's definitely fair to say. And then from that point, that just guides you through your load, and then you have the velocities. Whereas this next tab, this one you enter the load instead.
So real quick,
yep,
just for my understanding. So let's say I go in the weight room. I'm like, all right, I need to find out my max.
Okay.
I strap up my velocity base measure, and let's say my back squat max is 500.
Okay.
However slow I move that 500, that's my minimum velocity threshold.
Correct. Which
Gotcha.
for a high level power lifter, it was 0.33. And
let's say 0.25, because I'm fat and old.
for squat, if it's squat, I'm thinking it might be higher than 0.33. I'm thinking it might be a 0.35.
Okay.
Because like if you put 450 on your back, you ain't moving it fast. You know what I'm saying? You're just trying to finish
No.
it. So it
Right.
might be, but it might be between 0.35, 0.40. So, or I'm sorry, you ain't moving it slow either. That's the thing. It's like if you move it too slow, it's just gonna go straight down. I mean, it's your fighting
Right.
gravity, especially with the squat. So maybe a 0.35. I think Vitruve chooses a 3.7 for their squat, and that's good. I would definitely go with that. All right, so JT, let's say in 500, then you just walk in the room, you're like, do what every guy does. You put 135
Yep.
first.
225, 275, or 315.
Yeah, you're a big guy. Let's keep it rolling, right? 405.
Uh-huh.
Maybe that's your last set, right? It's 80% of your max, and you end up moving it at. Again, if it's important, this is your best velocity, and I probably should have put that here. The point of this particular tab, the load input velocity profiler, it doesn't do a whole lot more than just tracking maxes and profiling. So it's designed to just be that simple. So all you're really focused on is what was your best rep with 135. It doesn't even ask you how many reps you did, right? So 0.8, 0.65, 0.55. We're just guessing here. And let's say you move 405 at a 0.49. So it's estimating your max at 445.
Gotcha.
And your area under the curve is 417. So here's where.
Now explain that again.
Yeah, so area under the curve is best explained here. Check this out. This is me, Leo, and one of our athletes, Spencer Helms, who's now at Harding. He was a thrower for us. He's at Harding University now as a defensive end. Strong kid, right? And so Leo and I, we just slapped some weight on the bar. I worked up to 215 on bench. He worked up to 225. Spencer actually got a new max that day. He worked up to 275. So let's just compare how fast I'm moving 215, how fast Leo's moving 225, and how fast Spencer's moving 225. So look how fast Spencer's moving 225 to 0.69. Leo's moving it at a 0.57, and I could barely even move 215 at a 0.39. And my best effort, like I'm trying to move it as fast as I can, and that's what I get. So super training talks about this. It's strength, speed strength. How fast can you move submaximal weight? And that's indicative of sport performance too. It's not all about how much load. So area under the curve, then look at my area in the curve. It's much smaller. Think about square footage. Now Leo's is 295 and Spencer's is all the way up to 348, but our max is almost the same. I can actually bench 275. It's just going to be slow as molasses. And Leo too, and Spencer as well. So three guys of the same, max strength levels on a bench, but our area under the curve and our force potential is so much different because of how well he can move the submaximal weight. So this is arguably one of the most important evaluations, if not the important evaluation for athletes, is again submaximal weight and how fast you can move it. So area under the curve, all it is all the space here, JT. Underneath the blue, that's all the square footage I've got. Underneath the red is all the square footage Leo has, and Spencer has so much more area.
So ideally, you want more area under the curve. That's the goal.
The higher, the better. Yep. And it's a simple metric. You don't exactly know how you're getting all that area. Is it because your max is getting higher, or you're moving lighter weight faster, or both? But it's still an essential way to measure power, because it takes in both loading and velocity in consideration. So cool thing, something you can play around with. It's early in its existence. I don't know how many people will actually use it, but it could potentially be something you actually test your athletes on, or it's like trying to figure out, because you know how popular it is to just take bench squat clean and create a total score on that for a football player's potential. But it actually might be more strategic if you have VBT to evaluate athletic ability using something like this, like how fast they're moving the lighter weights. That tends to, because both these guys have way higher verticals than me. They can throw further than me. They're faster than me. Like Spencer's a freak. Like we're finding out that athletic potential is, especially with strength lifts, is shown up early in the submaximal loads, with velocity. So we'll move on if you are cool with that. So all these tabs here allow you to compare if you want. Again, none of this has to do with reps. It's just kind of like 1 rep max stuff. And then here's like another way to do it. We did an experiment as a staff this June. We all did presses with 25% of our body weight and 50% of our body weight. And here were the results. Here's how fast I moved 25% of my body weight. Here's how fast I moved 50% of my body weight. And here's the area under the curve based on that. And the person who won, we had a little contest, was DJ. He's a football player at Berry College. He was able to move 50% of his body weight way faster than us. So, and we also looked at relative to your body weight too. He had a high score on that. He's a smaller guy, but he's essentially quote unquote stronger than us, even though he can't lift as much weight. I mean, he's doing more with the percentage of his body weight. So anyway, we'll move on. Something that you guys can do with VBT. Now we'll get to the nitty gritty here with some of the dosing that will probably take up the rest of our talk here. So let's first scroll down to just a basic relative intensity chart. All right, you've got, the color codes of dark red to insinuate that this is max effort. And if you slide over, it's like 90% for 4, 82% for 7, 75% for 10, all resulting in a max effort set. And if you go down, you've got near max, very hard, relatively hard. So most of our training probably takes place here, especially if it's for volume with our kids. What's really cool about this chart that I made, and here's a newer one, I'll explain the differences, is that as you go within your session, JT, back to your squats, so we can slide you back in here. As you go through the session and type in your velocities as you go, the entire relative intensity chart is going to change to give you feedback.
Cool.
So like, okay, let's say you moved 1.2 or 1.3, 0.95. Again, I'm just guessing 0.75. Real data is always better.
So this will actually tell me where I need to stay at. Like if I want to be, like if I don't want to pass heavy. Heavy's like,
there you go, yep.
In my head, heavy's like my good range.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's not realistic for especially someone like me and you, to be training in the dark red every time, So this kind of goes back to our dosing conversation. And so, relative intensity is a key chart. It's been around for years, right? People use it all the time to think like, okay, where do I want to avoid? Where do I want to be? Now this is cool. It's not perfectly accurate, but it's pretty spot on. So if you think about, like, again, if you put real data in here, and I can probably go ahead and do that myself. So let me just take my bench data, I'll copy it, slide it back over, put it in here. So I'm gonna put it back over to me, knowing that my bench max is like 275 or 270 at a MVT of a 0.15. You guys are gonna need to change this again. I'll say it over and over again. Change your MVT around, play with it, because it affects everything, right? You see everything changing. If I can really hit 175 at a 0.12, then I'm gonna stick with that. But to be conservative, I might keep it at a 0.17. This is something you have to play around with. All right, so check it out. Now I'm scrolling down. And so if I'm doing 265 for 1, I'm probably gonna move it at a 0.16. If I do 250 for 2, I'll probably hit it at a 2.0, and then I can't hit 3. That's what it's assuming. I black it out. Like if it's an impossible set less than 0.17, it won't even show up. But if I change my MVT to 0.14, then anything less than 0.14 will show up. But it's still saying 255 for 2 is going to be the most that I do. So you can prescribe based on this. You have a load velocity profile, and you can actually prescribe for your athletes how many reps that they should get at that weight. And you can even customize it here. So you can enter whatever percentage you want. Again, everything in the gray you guys can edit without consequences of the formulas changing. So I type in any random percentage I like. If I'm a 67 guy, I like using 67s or 73s, then automatically it's going to fill out kind of what I could get if I decided to do 20 reps. It's with 65 pounds on a bench, right? This is, I can go on forever. I won't even hit green until I get to 20 or to 16. Well, this is helpful. Yeah, I think this is probably one of my most proud creations because I think it took me forever, but it's pretty cool. Here's a more updated version that includes the dosing over here on the right. Again, all you need to do is type in your loads and deloads, reps and percentages, and you get all the information. You can choose kind of what, this is a little different one. You can kind of choose how many reps you want to do. It'll tell you what your average velocity might be for 17 reps at 55%. It's all based on trend lines. That's the coolest thing about it. Here's where you can store some data and pull from it if you guys want to experiment and do a bunch of different lifts. Here is what I use the most, is a mini dosing tool, something that is quicker and less busy. Let me just hide these for y'all. So here's some front squats I've done in the past few weeks. Here's, I compared these two front squat sessions already. You can see all the data that you would want. I'm choosing my MVT to be 3.5. Here, I just type in my reps, my load, gives me all the information I want.
Do you adjust according, let's say you hit those numbers on session 1, do you adjust based off that data for session 2?
Yeah, I did. But yeah, here's a cool scenario, like real life of like me going through this process and just realizing how cool this was. So, I walk into my garage and I'm like, I'm gonna stinking do, I'm a man up today. I'm gonna do 205 for 8, 4 times, 4 sets. And I'm thinking I'm gonna die. Like I'm thinking I hadn't front squatted much before, volume wise. So I'm like, this is gonna be awful. I'm gonna do it. It's like 75% of my max, whatever. I'll barely do it. Look how well I move it. I ended up moving it. This is like where you can just see like the story here of like, at first I did pretty good. The third set was feeling it. My fastest was a 7, but I kind of bounced back these last 2 sets from the second set and still ended up on my 4th set of 8, averaging a 6.7 when my MVT is 3.5. So hopefully now you're noticing like I'm far from failing. I probably could have done 12, 13, 14 if I, was gritty enough in the moment or if I was programming that for myself. But if I do another set of 8 with 205, and then, okay, now I'm crashing because I'm dying, and I hit like a average of a 5.0, then notice my VINOL, how much it changed, right? Now the dose is real. Now it's like, okay, this was a serious session today. I did 5 sets of 205 for 8, and it's noted here on my last set that because I only got 5, it dramatically increased my VINOL. But here's the deal, man. Like, this is what's profound about this whole deal. And I hope people who are watching the recording or listening now, if you haven't yet, is my INOL was a 155. Meaning that, look on paper, based on my old max, this is supposed to be a really, like, intense session of, like, volume that I would have been sore for a couple days on. Like, a 129 is no joke, right? But because I had velocity involved and I looked at the actual quality of each rep and the speed of it, I now have an objective, quantified number to say that it really wasn't as bad. The dose really wasn't as strong. And if I'm feeling good, maybe in that moment, I'll go ahead and hit 12. And it'll probably drop this down to like a, 0.58. And now numbers increase a little bit. So I hope that makes sense. I hope it's comes off as profound to you guys as it is to me. I just prefer this so much better or so much more than RPE or reps in reserve because it's
everybody doesn't know how to explain that. Like I'll ask the kid, I'm like, where are you at on a scale of 1 to 10? And they're like, I don't know, 5. And they don't really know that they're dying inside. So it's hard. It's hard to pinpoint that.
Yeah, and here's the deal about front squats. You always feel like you're dying when you're doing, like, look at this. I did 25 for 10, right? And I actually thought I was I'm going to die on my third set of 10 with 225. Like I'm screaming in the garage, just having psychological warfare with myself. And it's a 128, man. 128 is no joke. So again, blue is actually, you kind of want to avoid blue unless, or for one particular session anyway. This is assuming that I still had to do maybe some pull-ups or some lunges or something. Like I was wiped out after this. Like that's a high INOL score right there, of, 128. And it actually predicted that was going to be a 160. So I still did better than what it predicted. So one of two things could be going on, right? Number one, maybe my max is actually higher. Maybe I actually can front squat 325. And so you notice how it drops my INOL score. Or the MVT is just off a little bit. Maybe the slowest I can move a heavy weight is actually different, and that's more like it. Like, I don't know that if I'm being honest with myself, a front squat slower than 4.0, at the full range of motion depth I was going at, I don't know if I could do that. So maybe that's more realistic. So this is why with VBT, you need the freedom with Google Sheets to basically manipulate some of these numbers from a predictive standpoint, because there's just too many variables involved. So this is advanced VBT stuff, by the way, and it takes some education to be able to even know how to play around with an MVT and know the difference between the two. And then VINOL, obviously, like no one's ever, to my knowledge, I'm the only one who's ever created something like this, using velocity to assess dose, with INOL in particular. So there's a lot of education that comes with that. That's kind of why I'm doing this webinar. But I think you guys get my point that things need to be adjusted. But once you figure out, at least for yourself and for your athletes, if you want, what that MVT is, then this could be a really helpful tool. And so going back to my real life scenario, like I was pretty fired up to do 225 the next week for 8. And I was confident that, okay, I moved 225, I was still staying pretty fast. So I'm gonna go 225 for 8. And I did, and it was tough, but I got it. And so my set average was a 5.5. And so now, I'm just feeling more confident. I do 225 for 10. Then I about died. Then I kind of hit my ceiling. I'm like, okay, yeah, I need to be more realistic about what I'm programming for myself. But you get the idea that this is real life feedback from a dosing standpoint, from a fatigue standpoint. And then the last point I'll make, guys, on the INOL thing is what INOL doesn't do. And so let me look at the full dosing tool to make this point real quick. Let me zoom in. So this is all the data right here. So look at INOL. INOL just assumes, like it does, because it's just a basic equation, that all my work sets are going to be the exact same, 2.7, 2.7, 2.7. VINOL is more realistic. It's like, well, that set actually may not be as the same load on my body because maybe I wasn't trying as hard, or maybe, psychologically I wasn't in that set, or vice versa. Maybe I crushed that set, and so I moved it faster. So the difference between VINOL and INOL is INOL just assumes that everything is the same, all the quality is the same. VINOL says otherwise. VINOL says, well, this one I moved quick, and then here comes fatigue. Fatigue happened, fatigue happened, fatigue happened. Now my INOL score actually went up because I'm in distress and my body is running out of gas. So this is key in any strength conditioning set and rep scheme. You're always dealing with fatigue, especially with volume-based sets like 74% for 8. You have to factor in the effect of fatigue throughout the set, and you get that with VINOL, but you don't get with some of these other things. You get it with RIR for sure, or RPE. You can definitely ask an athlete, okay, how many reps did you have in the tank on that set? Okay, well, on this set. And I'm not knocking RIR at all. In fact, I've actually blended the two together in a different spreadsheet. I think RIR is awesome, but if you have VBT, you might as well use it too. So one last thing, and then I think actually that covers it all. So the difference between the full and the mini, let me zoom back out. The full allows you to explore more of the data on this side and get a full picture of everything. It's a little bit cleaner. Power rating is something I can explain at another time, and even has RPE. So DJ, if you're still on, RPE over here is there's a non-VBT RPE score of an 8.7, and then there's an actual VBT RPE score of a 7.43, which again, I think is pretty stinking cool because it's like on paper, this is how hard it should have been. In real life, this is how hard it was. So the dose was different than the prescription, or the effect rather. And then the mini tool, going back to that, the mini one is just simply just this stuff. So all you need to worry about is like the reps, the load, the best velocity of that set, and the set velocity of all the reps. So if you're using push band, it'll automatically calculate the set average for you. You just have to pick which one was the fastest one, which in this case was a 7. And then you'll get all the data. It'll be good. So right at 3 o'clock, I actually thought this was going to be a 45-minute one. I'm going to say one thing, and I'm actually going to stop the recording. But I'm actually, so all these sheets, are viewable to everybody. But if you wanted to edit them, I'm actually selling them, selling full access to it. I'm going to put the price at $25. And all the money is going to support the country of Honduras and a strength coach that I know there and his family and their needs. So this does not benefit me at all. I did spend probably close to 100 hours and all this stuff, but I just wanted to be clear that I am offering this stuff up because it is worth something. I think it's valuable, but the proceeds are going to something greater than myself. So that'll be the last thing I say. I'll open up the questions and hang out with you guys for a bit. But let me go ahead and stop the recording. We'll go from there.